Hi Manick, it's really nice to see you. Thank you so much for joining us on the Zoom today. It's really lovely to meet you properly. I'm sorry I didn't meet you in the gallery the other day when you came to the exhibition. Well, it's her work, which she's created during the pandemic, and it's reflecting her experience of that and her life at the moment. And I thought maybe we could just think generally, because I know you've got a lot of thoughts about this. Perhaps we could talk a bit about what you see as, obviously there's been a lot of talk about how difficult it's been for the arts at the moment, but what do you think are perhaps the positives that have arisen during this time with the pandemic for the art world?
I think the positive is that, yes, it has created a massive upheaval for people like myself as a freelance arts consultant and arts workers and artists. You know, it's just literally thrown everything up in the air. You know, with lockdown, no galleries, museums, the public not being able to go out and see stuff, see work. So it did give us a chance to perhaps just to pause and to reflect, and particularly for artists as well as people that have a passion for art. For me, I kind of isolated for 3 weeks because I had COVID, and the stillness and just being able to kind of reconnect with my sense of space, which was limited, the garden, the house. But also just looking out to nature, to the quietness of the city. And I live in South London, the bustling part of the capital, and just pausing where there's no planes flying in the air. You know, you could hear the birds much more accentuated than ever. And also just made me realise about art and how much I take for granted when I just go to galleries and talk to artists and have meetings and have drinks with artists and writers. That all that was suddenly pulled away in this. So the isolation, while I welcomed it in a temporary way, I didn't think I want that in the long term. Did give me food for thought in how we can try and reimagine things in terms of how we appreciate art and how we enjoy art and how artists are making work. And I think, you know, tying it in with Claudia's experience of lockdown, how we still need to connect with people.
Yeah.
And that loss of physical connection, that tactility of friendships and relationships, is fragile, and we take it for granted so much. I know we always go through hard times, but to literally have to isolate yourself and distance yourself from other people, in a literal sense, was quite traumatic, I think. So looking at how art is reconnecting, I think there's a greater sense of compassion and humanity that's starting to emerge from artistic practice. There's less of the snidiness and the sneeringness, perhaps, that we might have seen 3-4 years ago, and particularly in another sort of fractured moment was the referendum and the Brexit vote. And I think these kind of two moments and how Claudia engages with it is really it's really powerful, but also full of compassion. So I think that compassion is really important.
Compassion is really important. And I think also what's been interesting is how, just thinking about the pandemic very quickly, is affecting people in different sectors of society and the older generation who are more vulnerable. And I think that's been, to have more respect for the older people, I think is really important, actually. And I think society's not often had that, just as an aside. But I think also with Claudia's work, like you say, there's definitely a compassion, and I think she openly talks about the kind of the time that it gave her being in the pandemic to put, even though she's always put her best into her work, to pour more love into her work, and it's given her that space. And just like you say, it's all about her human relationships, and even though they are fragmented, like the title of the exhibition, finding ways to connect, and the sort of, and in a way it's a sort of positive story about humanity and the way we overcome adversity. And that's something that art is often about. I'll come on to Brexit in a minute because that's an interesting point. But just whilst we're talking about sort of the effects of the pandemic on the arts, I wondered, and you sort of touched on it, but you know, thinking about the positives or the changes, I wondered what you thought about the sort of the focus now on the regional, you know, areas. And we've just opened up our gallery in Woodstock, for example. I mean, do you think London will return as the cultural hub for the UK? And how do you see there to be a sort of lasting cultural shift in the way we look at, you know, in the way the arts are in this country?
Well, I think we are all starting to rethink how we are living our lives in densely populated urban spaces. And you know, while the capital is an amazing place, you know, I think you know, one of the former deputy mayor of London said, you know, what London is to culture what Spain is. We go to Spain for the sun, we come to London for the culture. And what's missing now, I think, when I walk around London is the tourists, you know, the kind of visitors, the millions of visitors that, you know, will be teeming throughout the capital at the various big museums and galleries. And you know, seeing that empty out, there's a sort of melancholy about it, but there's also a sort of a greater, you know, again, like I said, you know, we take things for granted so much about where we are. But I think we are starting to rethink about, you know, how we live. And you know, if you just open any quality paper now, you know, from the Financial Times and property sections, they're talking about Londoners leaving London, going out and further into the home counties and the coasts and even up north, even, you know, if the Northerners will welcome us. And I think, you know, the rethinking space is really important. And I think for the arts, that's really exciting because, you know, the UK is not a big country. It's not like the USA. And, you know, there's no excuse to that everything should be focused and centred on London. So it's really exciting that we're kind of starting to see a kind of art ecosystem developing in other parts of the UK. And, you know, and various kind of funders, like the Freelands Foundation and Joe Wood and so forth, you know, are starting to really put their funds and resources into non-London and out-of-London initiatives, from artist studios to workspaces for artists, to, yeah, so, you know, galleries and artist-led initiatives. But also, I think, you know, it's great to see commercial galleries like yourself starting to evolve outside of London and have a presence, because I think what COVID has done is to start to get us to rethink who values art, and, you know, and I think it's not just the big international investors, but, you know, local people. So that sense of local tourism, that sense of going out, people that live locally to museums and galleries, whether they're artist-led or whether they are public or private, getting out there and starting to see things and valuing and perhaps buying more affordable art. And I think one of the great breakthroughs was how someone like Matthew Burrows, on his artist support pledge, you know, created this supportive community of artists buying works from each other, but also to the wider public that's affordable. Yeah. But it's not about pushing out the gallerist, but it's looking at other ways of engaging with artists in that sort of direct way. And that wouldn't have happened without the pandemic, actually. So we need to rethink the economy. We need to rethink how we appreciate art, yeah, and buy art.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, you touched on Brexit earlier, and obviously it's really interesting that you're founder of Artists for Brexit and a great supporter of freedom for speech. And obviously we included in this exhibition the Brexit Pot, and partly I think my reason for doing that at the time was that I wanted to showcase Claudia's more political work, and the way she has a series of work which it's sort of twofold. The Brexit Pot shows both, in that it shows her ability to create poetry and put it onto a pot and create a narrative in a different way, literally using words, and in that sort of great tradition. Then it also shows something that she does, which is to break pots, to make a comment about sort of fractured society. And obviously that's a really obvious sort of metaphor with Brexit and everything that we know that's gone on. But it felt to me that it was still a really important piece, and this issue of Brexit hasn't gone away, and it's an undercurrent to the current situation as well. And I wondered whether you wanted to comment more about that, and perhaps what we can learn about this particular work in the current international political climate.
I think her piece, Continental Brexit,
Yeah.
and she made that in 2018, so 2 years, approximately 2 years after the referendum.
Yeah.
And while COVID has overshadowed currently the negotiations on what the relationship will be between the European Union and the UK is underway. Michel Barnier is was recently, or still is, in London in deep negotiations with Boris Johnson. So it's really topical piece. And I think what I like about Claudia's approach to that subject is the nuance. There's a sort of dialectical relationship going on with that vase. I mean, her vases are beautiful. I mean, they're objects of beauty, as well as thinking William Morris, there's usefulness, but they are beautiful too. They're perfect objects to have in the house. What I think is wonderful about Claudia is the narratives that she creates, the human narratives with her pots, and Continental Brexit, where she made a conscious decision to, as a sort of almost like a performance, a moment of performance art, where she drops the pot, and as she talks about, the bottom falls out of the world because it's a pear-shaped pot, and I think her act of her performance act is just to drop it, not to throw it. Yeah. And that kind of shattered, the metaphor being shattered, people feeling shattered, probably has, over the last 4 or 5 years, been really manifest in people's kind of lives. The sense of uncertainty, the sense of the world, the bottom falling out of the world.
Yeah, I also thought what was interesting for me was the way she, and we've got a clip of her reading, because part of the performance is also she likes to read the poetry that she wrote on the pot. But the last line, the last bit of the poem I'll read, it says, "That fudge by the oven, thought Gretel may burn." So she called it a fudge, basically. She need not have worried, it was done to a turn, all went to plan, just as arranged. Brexit crumble was fudged, nothing changed. And I think I think what's interesting about Claudia is the way she sort of almost pokes and provokes, but doesn't necessarily come down, in particular this issue, on one side or the other. She's literally sort of laying it all out there and reflecting back at us what's going on, rather than taking a side, which I think is quite interesting. And it's all about the kind of freedom of speech and the freedom to have one side or the other of the argument. And I think personally I was thinking that's quite interesting in relation to what's been going on the other side of the world at the moment with politics, about respecting the process of democracy. And in a way, I don't know if you've got thoughts on that, but I think this is quite an important part in terms of just our views on democracy.
It is an important part, because we have to still kind of listen to both sides. And as an individual who I voted to leave the EU as an informed choice in my ballot box, on my ballot paper, and I think the healing is really important, but what I think Claudia does is how she uses the power of folklore, the Hansel and Gretel story,
Yeah.
and how and the power of I suppose that sense of the mythic. Is still important. These stories that are timeless, and the Hansel and Gretel story is quite is pretty. It's like a horror story. I think it's. It's not a simple children's story. So using Brexit, extending that metaphor to within the context of Brexit is brilliant. It's playful, it's witty, it's a bit macabre.
Yeah.
And I think that captures so much of how we're feeling, not only about that, because about that moment, where politicians almost become like kind of devilish caricatures, and and the EU bureaucrats like Donald Tusk with his tusks inside the gingerbread house, the sort of cannibalistic metaphor of the EU. I think it's really potent, and former Prime Minister Theresa May being sort of lost in the woods, but also running away from something. So this kind of no man's land. Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's a good piece. And I like how she does work with that, because her other pieces, there's a real sense of humanity, as you said, connection, particularly during lockdown, with in that those weeks of isolation where our only connection was through WhatsApp or through Zoom, and trying to find that sense of human connection through an electronic media is really a hard one to negotiate sometimes. You kind of still feel detached, you can still feel atomized, but yet we still want to share the joy of seeing our parents or our mom who might be far away, our friends abroad. And
I think that's, she does so well, is sort of she's a sort of litmus test of what's going on in society at the time. And I think, it'd be really interesting to know what your thoughts are in terms of the responsibilities of public collections in supporting the arts at this time. I know budgets are cut and everything's really difficult, but it seems to me that there's some quite important work still being produced, and that there is a responsibility for this to be captured and preserved for the future. I just wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, completely. I do think that museum curators need to perhaps just step back a bit from their own partial points of view, and to really look at how artists like Claudia are capturing the moments of these sort of seismic moments in our kind of current contemporary history, and how people in 100 years' time might want to look back at this moment, whatever the museum might be, whatever art might be. We want to look at the past in order to kind of see, kind of make sense of how did we get to where we are. And I think, what collectors, public collectors, and maybe people that bequeath stuff for public collections should do is really think about the moment and get out of the comfort zones of the usual galleries and go and see the kind of smaller gallerists and outside of the kind of the epicenters, and look at buying them. The government art collection, Contemporary Art Society, the various philanthropists that have relationships with Tate and regional museums. I think it would be wonderful to see Claudia's work in more public collections, and let's try and champion that, I think.
Well, that's wonderful, Manick. Thank you so much. It's been really interesting. I really appreciate you talking to us today, and I hope you're keeping well in this second lockdown.